To go along with the lesson that we had earlier, I wanted to talk about basically the way our world has become. You can't seem to listen or read the news without yet somebody else is being accused of some improper behavior. And people very readily accept bad news. The assumption that the person is guilty and that he is pressured then to leave his job or is fired. Simply because an accusation has been made. But I keep wondering what happened to the idea that, I remember being taught in school, person presumed to be innocent until proven guilty. But people will respond to that and say, well, somebody's bringing credible sounding stories, isn't that proof? And the answer is no. Well, shouldn't we give sympathy to the victims? Well, yes. But sympathy to the victim doesn't mean accepting what somebody says. We have to first find out who really is the victim. In that reading that we had in John chapter 7, Jesus ends that statement in verse 24 by saying, John 7 and verse 24, saying, "Do not judge according to appearance, but judge with righteous judgment." Now, in that reading, Jesus was accused of being uneducated. He was accused of having a demon. He was accused of breaking the law. And for that, people had already decided that he should be put to death. And there hasn't even been a trial yet. And that's what Jesus was trying to talk about. And that's why he said, stop just making, judgments off the spur of the moment. Use righteous judgment. So I want to talk about that for a moment. What constitutes righteous judgment? Well, part of it is that we have to have evidence. What constitutes good evidence? Have you ever thought about that? Because just somebody saying something doesn't make it evidence. For example, suspicion is not proof. Back in Numbers 29, and in verse 31, Numbers 5, verse 29. I'll get my glasses clean. This is the law of jealousy. When a wife, being under the authority of her husband, goes astray and defiles herself, or when a spirit of jealousy comes over a man and he is jealous of his wife, he shall then make the woman stand before the Lord, and the priest shall apply all this law to her. Moreover, the man will be free from guilt, but that woman shall bear her guilt. What is, in this particular case, is a matter is brought before God. A man suspects his husband or her wife is cheating on them. That's not evidence. So it's brought before the Lord. And because it would have been done in secret, well, you don't expect those who are involved in it to admit it. You wouldn't expect that. But making a conclusion without evidence is foolish. And so there was laws about how to gain evidence. It was brought before the Lord would testify as to who was guilty or not. But the proverb writer points out in Proverbs chapter 18, Proverbs 18 and verse 13, He who gives an answer before he hears, it is folly and shame to him. And that's what we have in this world around us. People making judgments, people giving answers, and all they hear is a suspicion of a possibility that something might have been taking place. That's a shame. That's foolishness. You know, accusations in the public arena is not proof. After all, there are people that do lie. Surprising, is it? No. People slander another person because of hatred or because of a desire for revenge. And so in Leviticus chapter 19, and looking at verse 16, you shall not go about as a slanderer among your people, and you are not to act against the life of your neighbor. I am the Lord. You shall not hate your fellow countrymen in your heart. You shall surely reprove your neighbor, but shall not incur sin because of him. You shall not take vengeance, nor bear any grudge against the sons of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. People will slander. People will tell lies. And they have various motivations for that. We ought to expect that. So just because somebody makes an accusation, how do I know that's an actual accusation or if that person's trying to bring somebody down? I have to look at the evidence. Jeremiah himself faced this problem. In Jeremiah 20, and in verse 10, Jeremiah 20, and in verse 10, it says, "For I have heard the whispering of many, terror on every side. Denounce him. Yes, let us denounce him. All my trusted friends, watching for my fall, say, perhaps he will be deceived, so that we may prevail against him and take our revenge on him." That's what Jeremiah was dealing with. They didn't like his message. Well, let's figure out some way to tear him down. We'll denounce him in some way. We'll just wait for him to stumble, and then we'll pounce on him. But we also need to keep in mind, not only is it wrong to speak lies about somebody else, it is also wrong to spread those lies. In Proverbs chapter 8:10 and in verse 18, it says, "He who conceals hatred has lying lips, and he who spreads slander is a fool." Now think about that next time you're on Facebook or some other one of the social medias. If what you're spreading turns out to be a lie, you're just as guilty as the person who made the lie in the first place. You need to be careful about what you're spreading. You need to look at what is actually there and look at the evidence. Now, of course, public leaders are particularly vulnerable to accusations because there are always people who don't like what they decided. And that's true in the church as well as outside. In 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 19, it says, "Do not receive an accusation against an elder except on the basis of 2 or 3 witnesses." That happens all the time. I've had accusations made about me. Brother Ray's had been accused of things as well. But we've got to look at and say, what is the evidence? And one of the things we ought to demand of ourselves is the same thing God has always said. Nothing is true until there's at least 2 witnesses, independent witnesses. In fact, let's talk about that for a moment. In Deuteronomy 19 is where this starts at. Deuteronomy 19 and in verse 15. A single witness shall not rise up against a man on account of any iniquity or any sin which he committed. On the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses shall a matter be confirmed. You don't bring to trial anything based on just one person saying this. Now, we got into a society that they're so eager for somebody to be taken down, they don't care whether there's multiple witnesses. We ought to, though. In fact, Jesus, talking about himself and that he is the Son of God, he said in John chapter 5 and in verse 31, if I alone testify about myself, my testimony is not true. He's not saying that I'm lying. He's saying it's unacceptable if all I do is I tell you what is true. It's not enough. Sometimes people wonder, well, all the way through the gospel, why didn't Jesus just come out and say he's the Christ? Because he does that just every once in a while, but for the most part, he doesn't answer that question. Why? Because it takes multiple witnesses. And he wants people to use the evidence, not his say-so. Because just because somebody claims something doesn't make it true. Now, going back to Jeremiah, in verse 39, Jeremiah 32, Jeremiah 32 and verse 9. It says, I have bought a field which was at Emahoth from Hamael, my uncle's son, and I weighed out the silver for him, 17 shekels of silver. I signed and sealed the deed and called it in witnesses and weighed out the silver on the scales. I then took the deeds of purchase, both the sealed copy containing the terms and conditions and the open copy. And I gave the deed of purchase to Baruch, the son of Neriah, the son of Mahashai, in the sight of Hamanal, my uncle's son, and in the sight of witnesses, who signed the deed of purchase before all the Jews who were sitting in the court of the guard. Think about what was done. Jeremiah wanted to purchase the land. And we do this all the time. What do you have to do? It feels like you're signing your life away when you buy something. But you're not just signing, there are other people in the room. They're also signing those things. Why? As evidence that it actually took place. There was proof that these transaction was done. And that is particularly necessary if you look at something that might involve the death penalty. In the Old Testament, in Deuteronomy 17, and in verse 6, it says, on the evidence of 2 witnesses or 3 witnesses, he who is to be put to death shall be put to death. He shall not be put to death on the evidence of 1 witness. Sometimes people get really confused about the story that's in John about the adulterous woman. Why did, Jesus told her not to sin no more, but he just let her go. Why? Because all the witnesses left. There were no witnesses. By law, she could not be put to death. Okay? You can't go on 1 witness. It's just not enough evidence. Okay? And those witnesses have to be independent. Now, in Jeremiah's case, they personally saw the transaction. They could testify it. But the witness also has to be independent. In other words, for instance, let's take 3 people testify that Jack said that Jill stole the watch. Well, how many witnesses do you have? All you establish is that Jack believed Jill stole the watch. And you have 3 witnesses that proves that Jack believed that. You did not prove that Jill stole the watch. It isn't proof that there's only one witness, Jack. And you have 3 witnesses that say Jack said it. That's it. We got to think about those types of things. That's why he says it has to be independent witnesses. Are you witnessing what somebody else already said, or are you coming from your own viewpoint? It also, by the way, implies that the witnesses have to agree. Take a look at John chapter 8. John chapter 8 and verse 17. Even in your law it has been written that the testimony of 2 men is true. Okay? The implication is that the witnesses agree. If they don't agree, then you haven't established something. And each fact of evidence has to be confirmed by multiple witnesses. Take a look at 2 Corinthians. 2 Corinthians chapter 13 and in verse 1. If I speak with the tongues... I got 1 Corinthians. 2 Corinthians 13, verse 1. This is the 3rd time I am coming to you. Every fact is to be confirmed by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. Every fact. So in other words, think of the story. If a witness A says he saw the defendant get out of a red car and walk into the bank. Witness B says he saw the defendant walk out of the bank with a sack. What have you established? From 2 witnesses, you established the defendant was in the bank. That's all. This car was not verified. The sack was not verified. Every fact has to be verified by 2 or more witnesses. By the way, that's why Jesus had, in Jesus' trial, they had problems. They couldn't get 2 witnesses to agree on all the facts. Now, also, the witnesses have to be credible. They have to be believable. In Deuteronomy chapter 17, and starting at verse 2, if there is found in your midst, in any of your towns, which the Lord your God is giving you, a man or woman who does what is evil in the sight of the Lord your God by transgressing his covenant, and has gone out and served other gods and worshipped them, or the sun, or the moon, or any of the heavenly hosts, which I have not commanded, and if it is told to you, and you have heard of it, then you shall inquire thoroughly. Behold, if it is true, and thing is certain, that this detestable thing has been done in Israel, then you shall bring out that man or that woman who has done this evil deed in your gates, that is, the man or the woman, and you shall stone him to death. On the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses, he who is to die shall be put to death. He shall not be put to death on the evidence of 1 witness. Okay, one of the points that we need to make, nothing's true, nothing's accepted at face value. You have heard that somebody is committing idolatry. Okay, that just means an investigation needs to be done. You have to inquire thoroughly and only accept it if it is true. Now, what you got to remember is you can be swayed if you hear only 1 witness and there is no examination. In fact, take a look at Proverbs 18. Proverbs 18 and verse 17. The first to plead his case seems right until another comes and examines him. And I've seen this happen over and over again. Somebody tells you a story. That sounds really bad. But then you go find the other side of the story. And you realize, oh, there's a lot more here than meets the eye. Everything has to be examined. You don't take somebody's word for it. Now, when we talk about witnesses, we're not just talking about verbal. You know, you can have a witness as, for instance, a carcass. Take a look at Exodus 22. Exodus 22 and verse 13. Somebody is claiming that his animal was stolen. If it is all torn to pieces, let him bring it in as evidence. He shall not make any restitution for what has been torn to pieces. Okay. If you claim that your car is damaged, you bring in the damaged car. You got a damaged animal, you bring in the damaged animal. Okay, that becomes evidence. That is one evidence. Okay. In Genesis 31 and verse 48. Laban said, "This heap is a witness between you and me this day, therefore it's called Gilead." Okay, there was a covenant that was made. How do you know the covenant was made? Well, here's a witness to it. They made a heap of stones as a reminder of the fact it was there. You know, a blood-stained cloth could be a piece of evidence. In Deuteronomy chapter 22, a man claims that the wife he was told he was marrying a virgin, and claims that I didn't marry a virgin. Well, one of the pieces of evidence that can be brought. And behold, he was charged her with shameful deeds, saying, "I did not find your daughter to be a virgin, but this is the evidence of my daughter's virginity, and they shall spread the garment before the elders of the city." The cloth that shows that she had blood. That can be evidence in a court. You know, we live under a similar set of laws. If you find DNA at a crime scene, that is counted as one witness. But it's not itself enough to trigger death penalties. After all, it says that material containing the DNA was found at the scene of a crime. It doesn't testify as to how that DNA got to the scene of the crime. So that's just one witness. Even a song can be a testimony. Take a look at Deuteronomy 31. 31 verse 19. "Now therefore write this song for yourselves and teach it to the sons of Israel. Put it on their lips so that that song may be a witness for me against the sons of Israel. For when I bring them into the land flowing with milk and honey, which I swore to their fathers, and they have eaten and are satisfied and become prosperous, and then they will turn to other gods and serve them and spurn me and break my covenant. Then it shall come about that many evils and troubles shall come upon them, and this song will testify before them as witness, for it shall not be forgotten from the lips of their descendants. For I know their intent, which they are developing today, which I have brought them into the land which I have sworn." God taught them a song and said, "You're going to keep singing this. You're going to teach it to your children, your grandchildren, and so on, so that when you do stray, I'm going to point to the song and say, see? You've been singing this for so many generations, and it has words in it that says you're wrong." And God can even be a testimony, a witness of himself. In Acts chapter 14. And in verse 17. And yet he did not leave himself without witnesses. For in that he did good and gave you rain from heaven and fruitful seasons, satisfying your hearts with food and gladness. God left evidence. He didn't expect you just to take his word for it. Okay? Even death can be an evidence. In Revelation chapter 12. Revelation 12 and verse 11. And they overcame him because of the blood of the Lamb and because of the word of their testimony, that they did not love their life even when faced with death. The fact that they would die for what they believed in shows how strongly they believed. In fact, our word martyr comes from the Greek word for witness. Martyria is the Greek word. And it was against the law to bear false witness. Like in the Ten Commandments in Exodus chapter 20. Exodus 20 and in verse 16, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. Okay? What a witness states has to be consistently truthful. That's something that we kind of lost sight of. It doesn't matter if the witness gives you some truth. The witness has to be consistently truthful. Take a look at Proverbs 12 and in verse 17. He who speaks truth tells what is right, but a false witness deceit. How do you get people to believe lies? Bury it in a bunch of truth. Well, if you understand that, then, hey, if I am talking to somebody and I'm trying to establish what really happened, and I know that something that person says is a lie, I can't trust anything that that person says. Some of the rest of it may be true, but the fact that he lied just ruined his whole testimony. Look at chapter 14 of Proverbs. And in verse 5, a trustworthy witness will not lie, but a false witness utters lies. Contradictions on important points causes evidence to be thrown out. And that's why in Jesus' trial, in Matthew 26 again, why they could not find enough evidence against Christ. Matthew 26 and verse 59. Now the chief priests and the whole council kept trying to obtain false testimony against Jesus, so they might put him to death. They did not find any, even though many false witnesses came forward. But later on, 2 witnesses came forward saying that this man stated, I am able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days. They kept going through all these witnesses. They were all false. They had to toss them out because they kept saying something that was false. They finally found 2 to say the same thing. But they should have tossed it out if they were lying about other things. You cannot be partial to someone also because they're disadvantaged. That's another thing that we got to do. Just because you feel sorry for the person, that doesn't make their testimony more true. In Exodus 23, and in verse 3, you shall not be partial to a poor man in his dispute. I might feel sorry because he is a poor man. That doesn't make his testimony true. I have to judge exactly impartially the same way as everybody. So in other words, there cannot be partiality towards an apparent victim. And that's what we find in the court of public trials these days. Oh, this person was a victim. Okay, that's what she claims. Does that make that person's evidence true? No. Does it make it worth more? No. It is just a claim. And after all, witnesses can lie. Take a look at what David said about people that talked about him. In Psalms 27, Psalms 27 and verse 12. Do not deliver me over to the desire of my adversaries, for false witnesses have risen up against me, and such as breathe out violence. It's not surprising. Public figures draw detractors. David was king. He's going to have people making all sorts of accusations. That's not surprising. And false witnesses have motivations to destroy public figures. He probably passed a law they didn't like. We're going to take him down. We're going to get rid of him. Now, a common tactic is to accuse a person of things that he doesn't know anything about. You see that all the time. The news media goes up and sticks a microphone to somebody's face. Did you beat your wife? And the guy's looking like, what? Where did this come from? In Psalm 35, in verse 11, malicious witnesses rise up. They ask me of things I do not know. You see this all the time. Somebody goes up to a politician, asks them about their opinion about some matter, some medical matter, and they're not a medical trained. But they're trying to catch them into something wrong. It makes the person defending himself look weak because he has nothing assertive to say to counter the accusation. That's why they do it. They're trying to embarrass the person. You also can get false witnesses because they're just following the crowd. Take a look at Exodus 23. Exodus 23, starting in verse 1. You shall not bear a false report. Do not join your hand with the wicked man to be a malicious witness. You shall not follow the masses in doing evil, nor shall you testify in a dispute as to turn aside after the multitude in order to pervert justice. In other words, I don't care if everybody and their brother claims something, unless there's enough evidence, it's not true. We see this all the time. Somebody gives out some claim, somebody else picks it up, they start spreading it across Facebook. Everybody's talking about it, and there's an assumption, well, everybody's talking about it. There's multiple witnesses, right? No. It all came from one source. They're not personal witnesses of it. We can't accept it. It doesn't matter if everybody. And if I spread it, I'm a part of the problem. That's what that law just said. I'm guilty of being a malicious witness, simply by spreading rumors. See, there's a tendency to believe the bad about people. Take a look at Proverbs chapter 18 and in verse 8. Proverbs 18 and in verse 8. The words of a whisperer are dainty morsels. They go down into the innermost parts of the body. They're like hors d'oeuvres. little sweet. You guys keep eating them because they taste good. When we hear rumors, they're like little dainty, we just can't seem to stop taking them in. In Proverbs 24 and verse 28. Do not be a witness against your neighbor without cause, and do not be deceived with your lips. If you don't have reason to testify, don't testify. If you didn't see it, that's not reason. If there's nothing happening that affects you, that's not reason. And the other thing is, wicked people tend to pay attention to wicked news, surprisingly, or not surprisingly. In Proverbs 17 and in verse 4, an evildoer listens to the wicked lips. A liar pays attention to destructive tongues. Now, when you have witnesses and you get disagreeing witnesses, that has to be investigated. Again, a witness can lie. So in Deuteronomy chapter 19 and in verse 16, if a malicious witness rises up against a man to accuse him of wrongdoing, then both the man who has the dispute shall stand before the Lord, before the priests and the judges, who will be in the office of those days. The judges shall investigate thoroughly. And if the witness is a false witness, and he accused his brother falsely, then you shall do to him just as he intended to do to his brother. Thus you shall purge the evil from among you. And the rest will hear and be afraid and will never again do such an evil thing among you. You shall show no pity, for life, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. If you testify falsely in the Old Testament laws, and they investigate thoroughly, because there's a conflict in the evidence, so they check it out very thoroughly. They find out, oh, you lied. Then whatever crime that other person was accused of, you got that punishment. Period. You lie somebody in a murder case, you just lied yourself into the death penalty. It was that serious. Notice again the need for careful inquiry into the matter. And there was no escape from the punishment. In Proverbs chapter 19, and in verse 5, a false witness will not go unpunished, and he who tells lies will not escape. So given all that, if you're called to testify, you have responsibilities. You have a responsibility not to give evidence when you have responsibilities to give evidence if you're charged to testify. For instance, in Leviticus chapter 5, and in verse 1, now if a person sins after he hears a public adjuration to testify when he is a witness, whether he has seen or otherwise known, if he does not tell it, he will bear his guilt. In other words, if there was a public swearing that you have to tell the truth, you can't leave something out. Otherwise, you become a partner in the person's crime. In Proverbs 29, and in verse 24, He who is a partner with a thief hates his own life. He hears the oath, but tells nothing. He's referring back to that thing in Leviticus. There's an oath that says you got to tell everything you know. If you don't say it, then you are a partner in that crime. That's the law that was used against Jesus in Matthew 26. Matthew 26 and verse 62. The high priest stood up and said before him, "Do you not answer? What is it that these men are testifying against you?" But Jesus kept silent. And the high priest said to him, "I adjure you by the living God that you shall tell us whether you are the Christ, the Son of God." He was told, you have to answer. Jesus said, "You have said it yourself. Nevertheless, I tell you, you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven." So Jesus basically said, you told the truth. I am the Son of God. And by the way, I'm going to come and sit in judgment on you guys. Which didn't go over very well. Okay. And in a murder trial, you have to understand something else about being a witness. In Leviticus 24. Leviticus 24 and in verse 14. So bring the one outside, and all who heard him lay their hands on his head, and then let all the congregation stone him. The witnesses in a murder trial actually had to lay their hands on the one who was about to be killed. And it was the witnesses who had to cast the first stone. In Deuteronomy chapter 17, and in verse 7, "The hand of the witnesses shall be the first against him to put him to death, and afterward the hand of all the people. So you shall purge the evil from your midst." I think I would make people stop and think. You testify against somebody that has a death penalty, understand you're the one who's going to be the first to impose that sentence. Ooh. That would make me stop and think. But what does it mean for you and I? We don't live under the old law. But there's things that we need to take from this. When someone brings an accusation, especially against a public figure, don't jump on the bandwagon and start condemning that person. If the accuser has a case, then it ought to be tried. And as much as you might want to sympathize with the accuser, proper evidence has to be gathered and examined. We talked about it in class this morning in Matthew 18, verse 15 and 17. Won't take time to read it, but it's again, if there's a private problem, it has to be first attempted to be settled privately. If it can, a few others are asked to both try to help solve the problem and to serve as witnesses as to what is said that can't be solved. And only if it remains unsolved does it go before the church, which now has evidence to be examined. See, what we need is members of the church who are wise judges. In fact, Paul talks about that in 1 Corinthians chapter 6 and in verse 5. "I say this to your shame. Is it so that there is not among you one wise man who is able to decide between his brethren?" And sometimes I wonder about that. You see that happening in churches. Accusations fly left and right, and no one sits down and says, okay, let's examine things. Let's see what the witnesses say. Let's gather the evidence. We can't allow ourselves to be pulled in to annihilate people just on hearsay. I hope you'll think about these things. I hope this was beneficial to you. It goes a long ways to settle problems in churches if people actually impose this on themselves. So I hope you'll think about these things. We leave an opportunity. If there's anyone who's not yet a child of God, there's no better time than right now to put on Christ. And for those who are children of God and would like the prayers of your brother on behalf, why don't you come forward as we stand and sing the song we'll select.
332.